Thanks so much for joining me for this edition of Office Hours. And today I'm going to be discussing how fiber and your fiber consumption can affect your susceptibility to viruses. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of health of the host versus potency of the pathogen. And it's such an important theme because when we look at even really virulent viruses, let's take Ebola, for example. We look at Ebola. Ebola has a high mortality rate if you get infected, much higher than SARS-CoV-2. But here's the deal. Only about 1 in 3 adults who are exposed to Ebola will become infected, okay? And a tiny percentage of children. So what is it about those 2 out of 3 people who are exposed to Ebola who don't become infected? And again, we're talking about the same virus. We're not talking about differences in viral virulence. We're talking about differences in host susceptibility. If we look at a virus like polio, something old that seems to be new again, at least in New York, where they've been finding it in the wastewater and sewage, and there've been a couple of reported cases of polio after vaccination, as those of you who follow this probably know. So a little bit different from wild type polio. Hopefully that's not something that we have to worry about on the horizon with orthopox and more COVID looming. But let's look at polio. In 0.5%, 0.5%, so very few people, poliovirus crosses the gut lining, gets into the bloodstream, travels to the central nervous system, and causes devastating paralysis, flaccid paralysis, right? But that's only 0.5%. So that's 1 in 200 people. What about the other 199 people? Why doesn't it do that? And so what we see over and over again, and the same thing for SARS-CoV-2, that the health of the host matters. Virulence of the pathogen matters too, right? A less virulent pathogen, we're all better off. And when I say health of the host, I don't mean just in general being a healthier person. I am talking specifically about some factors to do with host susceptibility, resistance, immune function that we know a lot about. And we know about some of this stuff from animal studies. So there's a very well-known study looking at susceptibility of mice to influenza. And this is a study from 2018, so long before COVID, SARS-CoV-2 was on the horizon. And what they found was that mice fed a high fiber diet were more resistant to influenza, less likely to become infected. And if they did become infected, less likely to be sick. Let me just see what, okay, more, oh, chat is disabled. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why that is. Let me see if I can enable that. Take a break in the middle of all of this. Okay, chat is disabled for some reason. So we'll just do Q&A. Thank you for pointing that out. I have to fix that in settings. Okay, so to get back to this really important question of host health and susceptibility, not just generally. I mean, of course, those general things, right? Exercise, get sleep, eat a healthy diet, all of that. But in the mouse study, they were able to drill down a little bit further. And what we know is that our immune system produces cytokines. And cytokines are different chemicals made up of different proteinaceous compounds, general term, different substances that basically direct the immune system what to do, right? And so the mice fed the high fiber diet had more recruitment and activation of T cells, the type of cell in the immune system that is involved in fighting pathogens, more recruitment of T cells, and more of the important cytokines were activated. But here's the other important part. The high fiber diet also dampened down parts of the immune system, completely separate, unrelated parts of the immune system that if not kept in check would lead to an overblown response. And this is the cytokine storm that you've heard me talk about. It's been all over the news over the last 2 years. So what exactly is cytokine storm? It is this concept of overshooting the mark. So we want to secrete enough cytokines and to fight the virus, the pathogen, to clear it. But we don't want to overshoot it so that you create such high levels of cytokine and such a robust immune response that you actually end up damaging tissue. You end up damaging lungs, that's acute respiratory distress syndrome, liver, heart, etc. So you want, again, the Goldilocks immune system. And so what they found in these mice who were fed the high fiber diet is that they had a Goldilocks immune system. They had adequate activation of T cells and secretion of the important cytokines, but they had dampening down of this overblown response. So they found that the fiber was really essential for creating immune balance. Okay, so I want to start with the animal study. We're going to talk about 3 more studies, and then I want to get into the specifics of the food. And I want to make sure you have time for all your questions. So let's go to another study from around that time, from 2018. That's another landmark study from the American Gut Project. The American Gut Project is a nonprofit that was started really by 3 people, and Rob Knight, Amazon delivery. Rob Knight, who's a PhD and brilliant microbiome researcher, is one of the founders, along with Jeff Leake and somebody else. I think his last name is Gilbert. So they started this nonprofit called the American Gut Project to really essentially enable this global citizen scientist effort for people to send samples and answer questionnaires, and for us to learn about the microbiome en masse, not just, looking at 20 white men at Mayo Clinic in Olmsted County, Minnesota, which a lot of the genome projects did, and they weren't diverse, neither geographically, ethnically, racially, based, gender, etc. So, anybody could do this. I think the price is $99, send in a stool sample. And they asked a whole range of questions. So they were able to collect this large database. And this particular study that I'm going to tell you about from 2018 was the largest human microbiome study that had ever been done, over 10,000 people, over 40 different countries. And what they found is that the amount of plants, remember plants have fiber, that's where you get fiber. There's no fiber in animal products like meat and cheese and yogurt. There's fiber in nuts and seeds and vegetables and fruit and root vegetables, etc. So they found that the number of different plants people were eating in a week correlated very, very closely with the diversity of the microbiome, which is an important marker of health, and the different metabolites that are produced, because it's not just the microbes themselves. The microbes are important, right? Which actual organisms are there. But just as important is what the organisms are producing. And we know that different microorganisms are pluripotential. They can produce one metabolite in certain conditions and another during other conditions. So you have to look at not just the organisms, but what they're producing. And they found that there was a direct proportionality between the number of different plants people were eating and the different metabolites produced. And what did they find? They found that more than 30 different plants per week was correlated with a much more robust, diverse microbiome and production of healthier metabolites. Okay, so more than 30 plants per week, and 10 or fewer plants per week was correlated with a much less healthy microbiome. Now, here's a really important thing. It didn't matter whether you called yourself a vegan, a vegetarian, a pescatarian, an omnivore, a carnivore. It didn't matter whether you were on a keto diet, a paleo diet, etc. What mattered was the amount of plants you were consuming. So there are plenty of people who, and I talk about this all the time, who say to me, oh, Dr. Chuck, can I eat tons of vegetables? I eat vegetables with every single meal, but they're eating peas, corn, and carrots, maybe some broccoli in heavy rotation. So the variety was key. And it makes sense intuitively. If we're trying to grow a diverse gut garden, we need to eat a diverse array of plants. First of all, we need to get out of the supermarket, get out into the farmer's market, or even better, do your own garden. So we need to eat seasonally, so we're getting that wide array. And again, this was the first study that was looking at the number of different plants. So we're going to circle back to that 30 or more, let's call it 31 number, right? Next study I want to tell you about is a study from 2021, 2 studies looking specifically now at viral illnesses. The first was from Dr. Kyo from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And this was one of the really, again, sort of landmark studies for us to help figure out susceptibility in terms of prognosis for COVID. And they took about 100 patients and they looked at the microbiome, and what they found was that high levels of a certain bacteria called Enterococcus faecalis or E. faecalis for short. We like to abbreviate these names. So high levels of E. faecalis, Enterococcus faecalis, was associated with much worse prognosis in these hospitalized patients. These patients were more likely to be on a ventilator, they were more likely to be in the intensive care unit, and they were more likely to die from COVID. And what was interesting is that this high level of Enterococcus faecalis was more predictive than age, comorbidity, et cetera. And this tags on to another study, which from UMass study from University of Massachusetts that showed something very similar in COVID patients. They showed that high levels of Enterococcus faecalis was associated with a poor prognosis, and high levels of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, F. prausnitzii, bacteria you hear me talk about all the time, was the opposite. You had high F. prausnitzii, that was great. You were more likely to do better. How accurate was this UMass study? And I believe the lead author was Contreras, Anne-Marie Contreras. How accurate? It was 92% accurate. It was way more accurate than looking at age, gender, comorbidities like heart disease, lung disease, whether you're a smoker, whether you had cancer. It blew all those other statistics out of the water. And when you combined it with those other statistics, it brought it up to a 96% accuracy. So this is crazy, right? But if you look at that 92% predictive accuracy, that's huge just by looking at what your levels of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii and what your levels of Enterococcus faecalis are. Now, why is Enterococcus faecalis such a problem? And again, many of us have Enterococcus faecalis floating around, but it's when you have a disproportionate amount. Enterococcus faecalis can cross that gut barrier, get through that, we talk about it being a semi-permeable membrane, can penetrate the gut barrier, get into the bloodstream, cause problems. And as it does that, it can bring virus with it. So we know that E. faecalis, Enterococcus faecalis, is also responsible for post-op infections, post-op sepsis, et cetera, even bacterial infections. So it is a problematic bacteria. But what is really interesting is the dietary associations between what people are eating and the levels of these different bacteria. So we know F. prausnitzii is the most prevalent bacteria in plant eaters, in vegans who eat vegetables, or in omnivores who eat a lot of plants. And so F. prausnitzii is highly correlated with eating a lot of fiber. And in addition to F. prausnitzii fermenting the fiber and creating short-chain fatty acids, one of those important metabolites I told you about that leads to immune balance. F. prausnitzii, when it creates a short-chain fatty acids, those substances are also really important for maintaining the lining of the GI tract, preventing viral particles from getting through, preventing bacteria like E. faecalis from getting through. So it's really a twofer, okay? It is setting that immune system at the Goldilocks level, active enough to clear the virus, not so active that you end up with cytokine storm and your lungs and rest of your body are toast. And maintaining that healthy gut lining. Because if you think back to a couple minutes ago when I talked about polio, I talked about polio getting into the body through the gut, right? Remember, our gut lining protects our insides, because when something is in your gut, it's not inside your body. It's in this long passage that goes from our mouth all the way down to our anus. That's esophagus, stomach, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, colon, large intestine. None of that is actually inside our body. It's this hollow channel. And everything that's in the gut lumen is actually in the environment. And then it has to get broken down and absorbed through into the gut lining, through the gut lining to the bloodstream, carried to the different parts of the body. So the gut lining is the barrier. That's the entry point. And that's why we see this association between damage to that gut lining and worse outcome from viral illnesses. And we have to think about what bacteria are involved in maintaining that gut lining, like F. prausnitzii, and what happens when you don't have sufficient levels. So the F. prausnitzii and other, Eubacterium rectale is another one, other bifidobacteria, but they keep the gut lining healthy and happy intestinal cells that are strong and can keep stuff out. So What else? Obviously, things like non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, ibuprofen type things can poke holes in that gut lining, but I want to really stay focused on fiber here. And that is why in study after study after study, we see that the proportion of dietary fiber affects the health and diversity of the microbiome, affects the health and strength of the intestinal barrier, and is correlated with basically, better outcomes after viral infection. And in some cases, no infection at all. And of course, there's a genetic component. We know that 1 in 10 people exposed to HIV will never become infected. They'll never develop AIDS. And really, they'll never even develop HIV infection because they're immune. And we think in that particular case, there's a genetic component related to genes that were resistant to the plague in Europeans back in the day. So there can be a genetic component too. And as some of you may know, our genome is about 5 to 10% viral, with different viral particles from viral infections we've been exposed to over millennia that have gotten into our genetic code. So they're actually involved in that genetic aspect too. So again, the link is pretty clear. The more fiber you eat, the more F-prosnitzi you'll have, the lower your risk for a poor outcome from viral illnesses like COVID. And as I've said before, you can't just go and borrow some F-prosnitzi from your vegan friend, because if you're not eating the food, fiber, to sustain them, you're just going to poop them out and they're going to die. You're not going to get meaningful recolonization, repopulation, etc. So that's why this food thing is so important. So before I open it up to questions, because you have quite a few, I also want to point out something about the amount of fiber. And I meant to have my green smoothie with me, but I didn't have time to make it. When you think about the number of plants, and I always, so let's say you're at 10, right? Not so good. You're eating 10 different plants a week. So you're in the not so great group, 10 or fewer. And you want to get up to that greater than 30 group. If you add 1 different plant to each meal every day, so it'll be breakfast, lunch, and dinner, a different plant, 3 times 7, 21. And you add that 21 to the 10 you're already doing, you'll be at 31. You'll be there. So what might that look like? If you're having eggs in the morning, you throw in a little bit of spinach. If you're having oatmeal, you put some sesame seeds in it. If you're not having any of that, you just munch on a carrot or an apple in the morning. At lunch, if you're doing a salad, you add 1 extra vegetable to the salad. If you're having, let's say you're having pizza, right? Not the best lunch, but let's just say that's what you're having. Throw some cauliflower on it or some broccoli, right? You even get credit for tomatoes, but since pizza already has tomatoes in it, adding more, that's not a different vegetable. So, throw some broccoli florets or some sauteed spinach, or melt some spinach on top of the pizza, wilt it on top. So add something, even to something that's not necessarily the healthiest. At dinner, if you're having, let's say you're a protein, starch, and a veg person, add a second veg. Steam a few green beans or something. So literally adding 1 additional plant. Could be a piece of fruit. And I love to use the example of oatmeal, because oats are a type of fermentable fiber, oats and barley. And of course, barley has gluten in it, and lots of people don't tolerate gluten. Gluten isn't great for the gut. But if we think about oatmeal and how you can dress up your oatmeal. So oats, great fermentable fiber, feed your gut microbes. It's a plant. You use some almond milk, number 2. Blueberries, 3. Walnuts, 4. Pumpkin seeds, 5. What else could you throw in there? Some shaved coconut, 6. Could probably get up to 7 with another nut in there. So you can get 6 or 7 different plants into a bowl of oatmeal, right? So that's a huge percentage of that 30, over 30, let's call it 31 different plants per week. And, so let's say you're at 6 with the oatmeal, and then at lunch, you are, say, having a sandwich. You throw some lettuce and cucumber in there, that's 9. Dinner, you have a salad with 3 different things in it, that's 12. And then maybe you have 2 different side vegetables, 13, 14. You're almost at half in one day. But remember, these are different vegetables and different plants rather. So you want to think about different fruit and, nuts, seeds, all of that. Okay, I'm going to stop talking right now and take some questions. Okay. So everybody's saying noon. Noon is better. 8 p.m. So we're kind of getting out a little bit of a range. But remember, you can watch all of these. We archive them. And last week's is taking a little longer because my wonderful Chief of Operations, Leslie Ann Berg, has moved to Tunisia. And she moved last week. And so giving her a little time to get settled in. So the one on stomach acid from last week will be up by the end of this week. And then we'll get back in a rhythm, you know, once she's settled, of getting them up. We try to get them up the next day. Okay. Somebody wants to know, how can you test for these bacterial levels, E. faecalis and F, it's Prausnitzii, Prausnitzii, but I think the spelling job you did was a pretty good guess. Yeah, so you can actually check for these. Enterococcus faecalis, you can actually do mouth swabs for it. These are not commercially available tests, but from a microbiologist point of view, these are not difficult to do. When you do a lot of the commercial testing, microbiome testing, and I'm not going to name names, but outside of American Gut Project, they're not always 100% reliable, depending on the technique that they're using to quantify the bacteria. So those are not always reliable. American Gut Project had suspended testing for a while. I think they're back open, so you might want to check that out as a good place to do it. Okay, Jean wants to know 30 different plants. Does walnuts, almonds, sunflower seed, peanut count as 1 or 4? That's 4. Walnuts, almonds, sunflower seeds, peanuts. That's 4 different plants. And again, they're not distinguishing between, is this a legume or a bean or a root vegetable? Those are 4. So they're all, you know, walnuts, almonds are nuts, but they are different ones. So Jean, you get 4 credits, 4 points for that. Yes, herbs count, Gina. So if you're doing cilantro, parsley, etc., those absolutely count. 5 p.m. is better. Okay, 5 p.m. is tough to do. 8 p.m. would be better from Jane. Thanks, Jane. So sorry about that digression. Yeah, so you do get credit for all those different plants. And here's the thing. When I talk to people about, you know, processed, unprocessed, et cetera, obviously the less processed the food, the better the fiber quality. I like to think of it very simply. Did this come from the farm or did it come from a factory? And so apple, farm, applesauce, factory. Applesauce has fiber in it, but the fiber is less robust in terms of what it's doing for your microbiome because it's processed. Okay, brown rice, farm, brown rice pasta, factory. Not saying never have brown rice pasta, but be aware that it's a more processed food and the fiber is less robust. So the startling statistics right now is that the average American is, you know, only about 10% of people are really hitting that 30 and upward grams of fiber. The amount for women is slightly lower, but 30 is a really reasonable number. And when I tell people, when I ask my patients to tot up their fiber calories, their fiber grams, I'll say, look, don't count anything in a box, okay? I want you to count your nuts and seeds, or again, nothing in a box that came from the factory. So you can count rice in a box if the ingredients are just rice, but you can't count the rice pasta that has a bunch of other ingredients in it and came from the factory, because there's no brown rice pasta tree or bush or plant, okay? So that means that the muffins and the breads and so on, I don't want you to count those. And the reason why, again, is that lots of people say, oh, I'm doing 40 grams of fiber, but it's all very processed fiber, and it doesn't have the same impact in the gut. What about a fiber supplement? Is it okay to use a little psyllium husk, a little inulin, a little acacia? Absolutely. Now, those are processed too in a way, but they don't have, assuming you're not buying the ones with food coloring and artificial sweeteners, they don't have other ingredients. And so I recommend, if you're doing psyllium husk, the ingredients should just say, you know, unprocessed organic psyllium, and there shouldn't be anything else in there. And so if you look at something like psyllium is a soluble fiber, but it's fermentable and it retains a lot of water. And that's how it adds bulk to the stool and basically, you know, helps to create a nicer, bigger, bulkier bowel movement that's easier to pass. But it also is fermentable. So it's also contributing to that process. So a fiber supplement is fine, but you don't want to rely on just a fiber supplement. And we see that in a lot of people doing these very low carb diets where they're eating primarily meat and non-starchy vegetables, and they're very constipated and their microbes are basically starving, and they're doing, a lot of psyllium husk or these fiber supplements. So, in that situation, I really recommend trying to increase the carbohydrate content with some fermentable fruits, vegetables, legumes, etc. If I had to tell you the number one food for fermentable fiber to produce a lot of short chain fatty acids, it's really beans. Beans, a cup of beans can give you about half the recommended fiber intake for the day. And so a cup of uncooked beans. So adding more beans, throwing them into a salad, making a soup, just adding them as a side dish can really, really help get you up into that level. Because again, it's not an accident. It's not like, oh, this one is lucky and ended up, making a full recovery, and this one ended up in the ICU. And by that, I don't mean to suggest that it's people's fault either necessarily, because there are lots of other things that can happen. There are diseases that can just fall out of the sky, or there's genetic predisposition, etc. But so much of this risk is controllable. Okay. We can't necessarily avoid the exposure. We may not even be able to avoid the infection, but we do have some control over our outcome. And of course, these things are in addition to all the other things that we have in our arsenal, like vaccines, et cetera, right? But it's really important because these things confer an additional layer of protection that's really important, particularly as we see the viral landscape really changing. Okay, couple more questions, lots more questions. Okay. I hear you about the farmer's market, but that's usually not organic. So I feel like we have to choose between the pesticides versus a less nutritious supermarket organic food like Mom's. Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because what we're seeing a lot in the supermarkets is industrial organic. We're seeing food. Remember what organic means, right? It means no synthetic pesticides. It doesn't mean no pesticides. It means no synthetic pesticides. And what we're seeing is a lot of that food that's grown industrially that has an organic label, because this is a big company that can afford to get that certification, is not even grown in soil. And it's grown in some big warehouse. So I really personally choose, I go to the DuPont Circle Farmers Market here in DC, and I choose a small farm that may not be organic, but the food has plenty of dirt on it. And I'll ask the farmer, these are often 5 and 6 acre family farms, like, what do you use on the food? And they tell me, and I believe them. And I think that food that often is grown biodynamically, sometimes there are animals, they're like moving the chickens over the field to fertilize the ground there that they're growing the plants in. And that's actually increasing the microbial richness of the soil. And those plants that are grown in actual soil with dirt on them are much more microbially robust, assuming, there's no Roundup that they're using. So I think it's fine if it's not organic, if you can have a conversation about where it's grown and what they're using. Okay. And, the other thing too, I bought some green beans yesterday at the supermarket, and they're in plastic. And the pre-packaged vegetable things, the French beans, they just didn't have any loose string beans. I don't like, because again, that's packaged in some factory somewhere versus, the farm, and they harvest it and it's just sort of in a big bin, right? So it's just all these stops along the way to get processed that end up eroding the microbial quality of the food. Okay. How much in quantity do you want to eat? Tanya, that's a really good question. X number of plants, but how much is a serving size? Yeah. So not a lot. For example, in a lot of these studies where they look at the nutrients from plants, so they're looking at something like, lycopene in tomatoes, you're talking about a tiny little, less than a handful, a few strawberries. So I don't think you have to get super dogmatic with the weighing and the measuring, but you're talking about, a small, like maybe a tablespoon of nuts, maybe 2 or 3 cherry tomatoes, small ones, 1 or 2 strawberries, really just a mouthful or 2 will do it. Okay. Do I see a benefit to raw nuts over roasted? Matthew, that depends on what else is going on in terms of heart disease risk, et cetera. But roasted nuts, of course, are roasted in oil, so they have a higher fat content. Now, that can be good if you're trying to increase your fat content. And if you're, if you don't have not worried about the amount of fat already in your diet, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, et cetera. So it sort of depends. I know for a lot of my friends and colleagues who are completely plant-based, roasted nuts actually provide some additional fats that they're looking for. So they're doing roasted nuts, avocado, olive oil, et cetera, trying to get more fat in their diet. If you tend to be a big animal eater and you're already eating a lot of animal protein and getting a lot of fat that way, then raw nuts may be a better choice for you. But for the purposes of this study, I don't believe they made a distinction between raw versus roasted. So it's a little bit dealer's choice, again, with some differences in calorie, fat, et cetera. So for me personally, do I see a benefit to raw nuts over roasted? I have to tell you, Matthew, I like roasted, the taste. Some things I eat raw, like obviously sunflower seeds and other things are raw, walnuts, but for peanuts and cashews and almonds, which are sort of my three favorite. And of course, we know peanuts are really a legume, not a nut, but for those, I tend to do roasted, unsalted. And then for others, pecans, walnuts, et cetera, I'll do raw. Okay, 30 different plants, spices, and herbs. My guess is fresh with robust fiber rather than residual fiber and dry dill or parsley or garlic. Yes, robust is always better, but I don't think you would get credit for garlic powder, but if you had some chopped garlic in a jar from the supermarket, you would get credit for that. But of course, the fresh garlic is going to be the most robust in terms of the quality of the inulin and how it impacts the microbes that are eating it. How much of the different minimally processed plants do you need to eat? I think I just answered that a little while ago, not a ton. I mean, if you were eating kale, it could be one of the lacinato kale, one, or the curly kale, one stalk, one, full leaf like that. Of course, we're also trying to get our fiber intake up in terms of grams of fiber. So these are really two different things. One is a variety of different plants to get to 30 or more a week. And then the other one is we're trying to get our fiber content up into that, 40, 50 grams of fiber. So that's where the quantity will come in. One stalk of kale gets you a point on the variety, but not that much in terms of grams of fiber. Okay, when I add more fiber, intra-abdominal pressure bloating occurs, making reflux worse. Yeah, so a lot of this has to do with how used you are to the fiber as well as a kind of fiber. So brassicas, for example, cruciferous vegetables, kale, cauliflower, cabbage, they have a poorly digestible carbohydrate in them, raffinose. And raffinose is, one of the carbohydrates that's getting fermented to those short chain fatty acids, but it's poorly digestible. A little bit of Beano, or there's some completely vegan versions of Beano, can help with that. Soaking things ahead of time, avoiding canned beans, all of those things can be helpful. And splitting up the amount. I mean, if I get a huge salad and eat it all in one setting, I can be a little uncomfortable, or if I decide I'm drinking 40 ounces of my green smoothie in one sitting. So breaking up the fiber is really important. And again, you can try some of these aids that have the enzyme in them, alpha-1 galactosidase, to break down the raffinose, like Beano, or you can try, soaking stuff ahead of time, cooking it with a sea vegetable like kombu. These are some of the things that are helpful for that. And the other thing about that with making bloating and reflux worse is you have to make sure that you are not constipated, because if you're already sort of blocked down in the colon and then you're adding all this fibrous stuff up, it's getting fermented, it's producing gas, it's likely going to bloat you more. So pay attention also to what's going on down below. And, if you're not having a good, robust bowel movement every day, you might want to add in a little psyllium husk, a little magnesium, something to get you going, to make sure that that's not the backup, where the backup is happening. Beet greens and beet root, two different sources of fiber. If I only get one question a day answer, skip this. That's okay, Jean. I'm not rationing. Yeah, you would actually get credit for two different things if you were eating the beets, like let's say you were eating some roasted beets and you were also putting some beet greens in a smoothie, that would be two. I like that you're really paying attention to the number. Do any teas contain fiber? Not a brewed tea, no. So, I mean, I guess if you're eating the tea leaves, but I think we all strain that when we make tea. So tea has other benefits of polyphenols and so on, but you wouldn't really get the credit because you're typically not eating this. Okay. All right. And, today actually I have to end a little bit early because I have to pick my daughter up and take her to a doctor's appointment. So I want to make sure if there are any last questions, let me run through it again. And, type the abbreviated names for the 2 bacteria you highlighted. Okay, let me type that. So Enterococcus faecalis, and I'm going to put in brackets bad, and Faecalibacterium prosnitzii. Typos. Good. Make sure I spelled that. Enterococcus faecalis, bad. Faecalibacterium, a little typo here. Bacterium prosnitzii. Good. Okay. All right. There you have it, Susan. I sent it. So pre-soaking beans, kelp, episode, etc., won't negate the beneficial fiber effect. No, not at all, Jean. You still get credit. All right. So we're going to wrap it up a little bit early today. I apologize. And then next week we have microbiome and aging and some really interesting data there. But I want you to, all this advice that our parents and our grandparents gave us, like it's actually true about sleep and rest and water and fiber and these really simple things. But we have really beautifully sophisticated experiments in humans and in mice, etc., really validating these things. And these things are really, really important. I see this all the time, the difference in my patients, right? In terms of how they're eating. And again, there are other factors, but this is one of the most important associations. So I want everybody to go and make a smoothie or eat a carrot or throw some chickpeas in their salad or cut up some leeks and just really think about that number. It can be a fun game, especially if you have kids, youngish kids or older kids. It can be a fun game to see how many different plants you can get in the meal. And that doesn't mean that they may still not have some ice cream or chocolate at the end of the meal as a dessert, but they may have a couple pieces of fruit and maybe even some different fruit ahead of time to get in that number. And I'm a very, very strong advocate for it's more about what you're missing than, okay, you ate something bad, but it's really about the lack of the good stuff. So, if they want to have something bad, they want to have some mac and cheese or something that is not as nutritious, you can drown that out with some green beans, some Brussels sprouts, some spinach, etc. So do get your kids engaged in this and get yourself engaged in it. And, shoot me a message about how many different plants you're having. I would love to hear from you. All right, everyone. Bye-bye.